Part 1. Opening Cinematic Hook. For the next few minutes, I want you to picture this. A winter storm so brutal it stripped paint off cabins, split stovepipes in half, and froze buckets of water solid, all before midnight. A storm so cold that every man, woman, and child in Red Valley feared they wouldn't live to see the dawn. And right in the middle of that deadly white wilderness, there stood a strange little mound in the hillside. A place every neighbor once mocked and laughed at. But when the White Howl of '94 came tearing down from the Iron Mesa, that odd mound under the earth held something almost no cabin could. Warmth. Steady, life-saving warmth. More than 25 degrees warmer than anything above ground. Welcome back to Frontier Ways. Today I'm going to tell you a story that is equal parts survival lesson, forgotten engineering, and a humbling reminder that nature always rewards the ones who listen. This is the tale of Silas Rourke, the man folks said was digging his own grave, when in truth, he was building the only shelter in the valley that could stand against the coldest night in living memory. The funny thing about frontier life is this. Out here, the truth doesn't shout, it whispers. And most folks don't hear it until the wind is already howling at the door. But those who do hear it, those who prepare early, who think differently, who trust the land instead of fighting it, they're the ones still standing when winter bares its teeth. So settle in, friend, because the lessons hidden in this story may just save you from your own storm one day. Part 2, Chapter 1, Red Valley Fall, 1893. The fall of '93 crept into Red Valley earlier than anyone expected. The cattle grew restless. Geese took flight 2 weeks ahead of their usual time. The air tasted sharper, as if winter was already licking its lips. Every settler in the basin knew what that meant. You built fast, and you built high before the frost sealed the ground like iron. Wagons rattled down the ridge roads with lumber. Hammers rang across the open fields as families raised their cabins, plank by plank. Marlin Cutter, the valley's proud material dealer, couldn't stop smiling. Business was good, fear was high, and everyone wanted walls before the world froze shut. Everyone. Except Silas Rourke. While his neighbors cut timber and stretched tar paper, Silas worked alone on the southern slope of Iron Mesa, digging into the earth as though he meant to disappear under it. Folks stopped their wagons and stared. Helena Ledger, who ran the general store and kept weather notes more faithfully than the government, wrote in her journal that week, "Rourke's gone peculiar. Says he don't need a cabin. Says the ground will keep him warm. The valley laughs, but I'm not so sure." By the third week of October, the frost came heavy enough to turn grass silver and crack the edges of every watering trough in Red Valley. Yet Silas kept digging, shaping the earth with quiet confidence, measuring with a knotted rope instead of a fancy tool. And every night, the neighbors whispered louder. Some said he was too poor to buy lumber. Some said he'd lost his mind. Others said the man must be planning to hide from something or someone. But if you'd watched him closely, you'd have seen something different. You'd have noticed the way he studied the slope, the way he tapped the soil to listen for moisture beneath, the way he tested how the afternoon sun slid across the doorway he had carved. He wasn't guessing, he wasn't lost, he was preparing. And that is a lesson most people forget. The frontier didn't punish lack of strength, it punished lack of foresight. Silas, in his quiet way, saw something everyone else missed. He knew that winter is not fought with muscle alone, it is survived through design. Part 3, Chapter 2, The Mockery. It didn't take long for the laughter to start. One crisp morning, as Silas hauled another load of clay out of the hillside, Marlin Cutter pulled up in his wagon and called out, "Rourke, if you're fixin' to bury yourself, at least let us carve a headstone first." The farmhands riding with him roared with amusement. A man building downward made no sense to them. Their whole lives they'd been taught that a real home must stand tall against the wind, not crouch beneath it. Day after day, word spread across the valley. The Rourke hole, the fox burrow, the poor man's pit. Children pointed, women shook their heads, and the men, well, frontier pride makes a man bold in his judgments. And judgment came easy when they saw Silas scraping at the earth while their own cabins rose proud and square above the grass. Only one person didn't laugh. Old Sparrow, an elder of the Sky River people, who had seen more winters than any settler in that basin. She walked up to Silas one afternoon, leaned on her willow stick and asked softly, Have you cut the water path yet? Her eyes were sharp. She knew what he was building before anyone else did. Elias wiped his brow and nodded. A foot deep, sloped just right. The hill will carry the melt away. Old Sparrow smiled, not the smile of mockery, but recognition. The earth holds more heat than wood ever will, she said. The wind cannot steal what it cannot touch. But of course, Red Valley didn't want to hear wisdom in those days. People prefer the comfort of familiar mistakes over the discomfort of unfamiliar truths. They wanted houses that looked like houses. They wanted pride, not performance. And that, right there, is one of the oldest lessons of frontier life. Folks often laugh at what they don't understand, right up until the moment they need it to survive. Part 4, Chapter 3, The Earthhouse, The Hidden Home. As the valley mocked him, Silas Rourke kept shaping his quiet rebellion beneath the hillside. And if you stood there beside him, watching how his hands worked, you'd understand that this wasn't a man gambling with his life. This was a carpenter who had learned, through hunger, migration, and the raw lessons of the land, that the earth itself could be a partner if you knew how to speak its language. He carved a chamber 12 feet deep into the warm belly of the slope, benching the walls in clean steps to stop collapses. Each stroke of his spade was deliberate. He didn't fight the soil, he read it. He tested its firmness with the back of his boot, checked its dryness by crumbling it between his fingers, and listened to how the echo changed the deeper he carved. Clay this dense was a blessing. It held shape, it held heat. And heat was the one currency winter could never counterfeit. Before any roof went on, Elias planted cottonwood posts, peeled and fitted, spaced just right so each touched the ground with purpose. He scribed them against the earth, pressing each post into the wall like a puzzle piece shaped by patience and understanding. Between the posts, he packed a clay and straw mix thick enough to block every draft. Not a crack, not a knot hole. Nothing the wind could bully through. Then came the French drain, a shallow trench circling the uphill side. Gravel and fieldstone laid in a gentle slope designed with quiet genius. Most folks in Red Valley built as if water was an enemy. Elias built as if water simply needed a safe path to travel. Guiding water is always easier than fighting it. That's a lesson homesteaders forget, right until the thaw steals half their heat. When the roof went on, the neighbors whispered again, calling it the strangest sight they'd ever seen. Elias laid willow brush first, then grass thatch, then sod, thick, living blocks cut from the prairie, placed roots down like shingles grown from the land itself. And slowly, the roof transformed into a living skin, a membrane that breathed with the seasons. It wasn't pretty by Red Valley standards, but it wasn't meant to be admired. It was meant to endure. The beauty of this kind of architecture is subtle. A house above ground must fight the world every second. Wind pushing at its seams, frost gnawing at its joints, heat fleeing through every surface. But a house within the earth? It leans on the oldest thermal battery we know. Below the frost line, the ground holds steady like a heartbeat, warm enough to keep a man alive even when the air outside can freeze a lung. Elias wasn't building a shelter. He was building a lesson. One Red Valley would come to learn through fire and ice. Part 5, Chapter 4, Fall Turns Merciless. By late October, the valley shifted. The color drained from the hillsides as though someone had pulled a gray sheet over the world. You could smell winter rising from the soil. Horses stamped nervously. The cattle on the ridge lifted their heads toward the north wind and bawled long, uneasy calls. Animals know. They always know. The first hard freeze came overnight. One moment the troughs were full, the next morning they were cased in glass. Tar paper snapped against half-finished cabins like the warning flags of an oncoming war. And inside those cabins, something unsettling began. The nails holding the walls hummed as the wood contracted in the sudden cold. It was the frontier's way of telling folks, "You're not ready." The Birdwell family felt it first. Their roof, rushed and underfunded, began to breathe, and not in a good way. Every gust of wind sent a cold finger down into the rafters. Their little boy woke coughing in air that tasted of dust and frost. They patched and stuffed and prayed, but the cold found its way through every board. The Huxleys, proud and seasoned, had built better. Their cabin stood straight, solid, respectable. Yet even they couldn't stop the frost from forming rings on the nail heads. Helena Ledger wrote in her notebook. Inside the Huxleys' cabin, the cold blooms like flowers no one asked for. Across the valley, Silas Rourke lit a small fire in his earthhouse for the first time. He sat quietly, listening to how the heat moved through the chamber. The warmth spread slowly, not rushing up and escaping like in the cabins above, but seeping gently into the walls, sinking into the earth, storing itself for the night to come. The temperature rose to a soft, comforting heat. Nothing dramatic, just steady, even warmth. The kind of warmth that makes you exhale without thinking. And that's when the quiet miracle of earth sheltering revealed itself. While cabins lost heat the instant the flames faltered, Elias's dug-in dwelling cooled only a degree or two over hours. The ground was doing half the work for him, smoothing every fluctuation, resisting every bite of the cold. Helena paused outside his hidden doorway one evening. She ran her hand along the sod roof, feeling the faint warmth beneath. She didn't say a word, but she wrote later, "Something is different here. He built into the earth, not on top of it, and the earth seems to approve." Part 6, Chapter 5, 3 Cabins and 1 Earthhouse. Before the storm arrived, Red Valley held what you might call a quiet competition, though no one named it out loud. Every settler believed their cabin was proof of their skill, their pride, their right to claim the land. And Helena Ledger, ever the observer, began tracking how each home fared as the nights turned sharper. The Huxleys had the strongest build. Thick boards, tight seams, a stove big enough for a blacksmith's shop. On paper, they should have been invincible. Yet even they fought an unending battle with drafts that slithered through knot holes and the shrinking spaces between boards. Their cabin could hold warmth, but only as long as someone was awake to feed the stove. The Birdwells had heart, but not means. Their single-wall structure shivered at every change in wind direction. They burned through their stack of split wood twice as fast as they expected. Each night, they tucked their children into quilts warmed by stones heated on the stove. But stones cool quickly in a room that bleeds heat faster than you can replace it. Marlin Cutter's cabin, though handsome and square, had an arrogance built right into its beams. Cutter believed thickness alone was enough, so he boarded over openings with whatever wood he had on hand. But air is a patient enemy. It finds cracks you didn't know were there. And a beautiful cabin can still become a cold box when the temperature falls hard. Helena's notes show the numbers clearly. By early November, temperatures inside each cabin dropped 20 to 30 degrees within 3 hours of the fire dying. Drafts multiplied. Frost crept along the floorboards. Water buckets grew thin skins of ice even beside the stove. It was the slow unveiling of a painful truth. Above-ground cabins depend entirely on man's energy to stay warm. Miss a few hours and winter takes everything back. But down in the slope of Iron Mesa, the earthhouse told a different story. With only a modest fire, Elias kept his dwelling in the high 50s, comfortable by frontier standards. When he let the flames die, the temperature drifted only a few degrees. Because the earth itself was his insulation, the cold had nowhere to seep, no open angles to attack, no exposed surfaces to drain heat from. Nature, for once, was working with him. Frontier wisdom is simple. The more surfaces you expose to the world, the more the world takes from you. A cabin has 6 sides. Elias's home had only one, the doorway. And when you reduce your weak points, you reduce your losses. Helena Ledger summed it up in one line: 3 cabins stand proud above the grass, and 1 hides beneath it. Yet only 1 behaves like it understands winter. Part 7, Chapter 6, Hints of the White Howl. By the first days of December, Red Valley felt wrong in a way no one could quite name. The sky refused to move. Clouds hung low and heavy, like wool pulled tight across the horizon. Even the wind seemed to wait, crouched in some unseen corner of the valley, holding its breath before the strike. Animals sensed it first. Rabbits vanished into the sagebrush, leaving only faint tracks that froze solid each night. Coyotes stopped their nightly singing, and the old ranchers, men who bragged they feared nothing, began waking in the middle of the night without knowing why, listening to a silence so complete it felt like the land itself was bracing for impact. Helena Ledger, ever faithful to her weather journal, wrote, "There is a kind of stillness that does not belong to this valley. Air too quiet, cold too dry. Something is gathering." Silas Rourke noticed the signs too. He walked the ridge above his earthhouse, feeling the sky press down on the land. Snow hadn't come yet, but the cold had sharpened into a strange metallic taste. The kind of cold that didn't just freeze water, but froze thought. He checked his air vent, tested the seal of his doorway, and added one more wool blanket as an airlock, hung a finger's width below the lintel. A small detail, but small details save lives when winter means business. Neighbors, meanwhile, dismissed the unease as superstition. Marlin Cutter laughed from his wagon, insisting it was just another cold snap. But his horse, usually stubborn as a mule, refused to stand still, shifting nervously beneath him. Nature whispers warnings long before she raises her voice. Folks would do well to listen. On December 7th, the last and clearest sign came. A flock of starlings, thousands strong, lifted from the valley floor and screamed southward, moving in a single black ribbon across the pale sky. They didn't circle, didn't hesitate, just fled. And as the final birds vanished over the rim of Iron Mesa, the air behind them sank into an eerie, echoing quiet. Elias paused at the doorway of his earthhouse, running one hand across the warm sod of the roof. "It's coming," he murmured. Not in fear, but in recognition. Frontier lesson: storms don't strike without warning. The land always speaks first. Only question is, who's listening? Part 8, Chapter 7, The White Howl 94. The storm arrived in a single violent breath. One moment the valley sat in its frozen stillness, the next, the northern horizon folded inward like a collapsing wall. A roar rolled across the plain, a deep rising sound that made cattle stumble and children bury their faces in their mothers' coats. Then came the wind. Not a breeze, not a gust, but a living force, howling down from Iron Mesa with the ferocity of 1,000 wolves. The White Howl had come. Temperatures dove as if the sky had been ripped open. 10 degrees above zero fell to 20 below in under an hour. And the wind tore through Red Valley like a jealous spirit, prying at shingles, shattering loose boards, forcing its way into every cabin seam it could find. Inside the Huxleys' cabin, the stove glowed bright, flames licking the iron grate, but the heat vanished almost as quickly as it was made. Frost spidered across the window glass. Breath hung in the air like smoke. Little Annie Huxley watched her mother wrap blankets around the baby and whispered, "Mama, the walls are shaking." In the Birdwell's home, the cold was merciless. Every nail hummed with contraction. The tar paper snapped like a whip with each burst of wind. Their youngest began to cry out from fear, but from the sting of air so cold it bit his lungs. And Cutter's grand cabin, proud, square, built to impress, fared no better. A decorative beam split down the middle, sending a crack through the ceiling. Cutter, red-faced and sweating from the effort of feeding his oversized stove, realized the cruel truth. Heat built fast escapes fast. Fire was no match for a house the wind could enter at will. But in the earthhouse beneath Iron Mesa, the storm found no purchase. The wind flowed over the sod roof like water over stone. The doorway, recessed and shielded, took the hit without flinching. Inside, Elias sat on a small wooden stool, reading by lamplight, while the walls around him held their steady warmth. 52 degrees, comfortable, calm, a world away from the chaos outside. He listened to the storm, and it sounded distant, muffled by the weight of the earth. He let the fire go low, knowing the ground would carry him through the night. That's the gift of thermal mass, a slow, faithful pulse of heat that no wind can steal. Meanwhile, the cabins above shuddered and bled warmth with every scream of the gale. By midnight, frost had formed on the inside of the Huxley cabin walls. By 2 in the morning, the Birdwell's water bucket cracked. And just before dawn, Cutter's stovepipe contracted so violently it loosened from its collar, spilling smoke back into the room. This wasn't a test of strength, it was a test of design. The White Howl didn't care about pride or appearances. It cared only about physics. And physics was on Silas Rourke's side. Part 9, Chapter 8, Pride Collapses Before the Cold. The first to break was the Huxley cabin. Around 3 in the morning, their fire, tended faithfully for hours, finally succumbed to the draft, pulling down through the shrinking gaps in the walls. John Huxley, exhausted, slumped against the stove. He banked the coals well enough. But winter does not forgive a moment's rest. Within minutes, the fire was dead. The temperature dropped like a stone in water. 38 degrees, 32, 27. By the time John woke in a panic, Ice had already formed along the rim of the wash basin, his breath clouded in thick plumes. The baby began to cry, a thin, sharp cry that only desperate cold can force from a child. John grabbed his coat, shook his teenage son awake, and whispered, "We have to go." Pride had held him in that cabin long after wisdom said to run. But a man's pride means nothing when his family trembles at death's doorstep. They stepped into the storm, leaning their bodies into a wind that clawed at them like talons. Snow slashed sideways across the valley, erasing the world beyond a few steps. They staggered through drifts, half blind, guided only by memory and hope. And finally, after a long, desperate push, John's fist struck the wooden doorframe of Silas Rourke's earthhouse. Inside, Elias rose from his stool, lifted the latch, and opened the warm glow of safety into the razor-cold night. John fell forward, clutching his child, unable to speak. Elias didn't ask questions. He simply pulled them inside and shut the door against the screaming wind. Not long after, the Birdwells arrived, carrying their children wrapped in quilts that had frozen stiff at the edges. Their faces were gray, lashes frosted white. Elias guided them in gently, offering warm stones from beside the stove and a place to rest. The earthhouse grew crowded, but its temperature barely changed. Only pride was thinning now, melting away faster than the frost on their cheeks. Then came Cutter. His arrival was almost unbelievable. Cutter, the man who had laughed loudest at Elias, the man who'd sworn he'd never let himself live like a badger, stumbled toward the doorway just after dawn. Smoke stains smeared his coat, and his hands shook uncontrollably. His cabin was cold as a barn and twice as dangerous after the stovepipe collapsed. Elias opened the door. Cutter tried to speak, but only managed, I was wrong. Elias looked into his neighbor's eyes filled with terror, humility, and a kind of gratitude words can't quite hold, and said simply, "Come in." Because the frontier teaches one thing above all: winter doesn't care about your dignity, and survival never belongs to the proud. It belongs to the prepared. Part 10, Chapter 9. The earthhouse becomes a life shelter. By sunrise, the earthhouse was no longer just a home. It had become the valley's last refuge. 8 people crowded inside at first, then 10, and by mid-morning 12 souls sat packed shoulder to shoulder, shaking off cold that had nearly stolen their breath. Yet something remarkable happened. Instead of suffocating under the weight of so many bodies, the little room began to warm. A dozen lungs breathing, a dozen hearts beating, a dozen small pockets of heat rising toward the sod roof. Each human was a tiny stove of their own, and the earthhouse, designed to hold warmth like a cupped hand, accepted their heat and gave it back slowly, steadily. Elias moved deliberately, adjusting the intake vent near the floor until it opened a 1/4 inch, letting in just enough air to keep everyone alert without letting warmth flee. Then he lifted the south-facing window, only the width of a finger. A delicate balance. Too much air, and the cold would flood in. Too little, and carbon dioxide would thicken the room with dizziness. But Elias had lived through storms far from this valley. He knew ventilation wasn't a luxury, it was survival. The families huddled close as their bodies thawed, sharing blankets, shared fear, shared gratitude. The Birdwell children stopped trembling. The Huxley baby, for the first time in hours, let out a soft coo. The room sighed with relief. Meanwhile, Elias fed the fire with measured care, not desperation. Just a small handful of wood every hour, not the frantic armloads that the cabins above demanded. The earthhouse didn't need heroic effort. It only needed respect for the physics that governed it. Helena Ledger, clutching her journal to her chest, whispered, "It shouldn't be possible, not with this cold." But Elias only smiled. "The ground doesn't panic," he said. "That's why it keeps us alive." Outside, the White Howl continued its violent orchestra, slashing at every structure still standing. But underground, there was a different world. Calm, warm, patient. A world built not from defiance, but from understanding. And that's the quiet genius of the earth shelter. It doesn't fight winter. It borrows strength from the one thing winter fears most, the steady heat sleeping beneath the frost. Part 11, Chapter 10, The Longest Night. Even after Cutter stumbled in, the storm refused to relent. If anything, it grew sharper, colder, as if angered that so many lives had slipped from its grasp. By nightfall, temperatures dropped again, plummeting below anything Red Valley had recorded, 45 degrees below zero, wind slicing like broken glass. snow drifting so high it swallowed fence posts whole. Inside the earthhouse, the air stayed warm enough for breath to rise in soft curls. The people gathered near the center, forming a human circle around the small stove, though the stove barely seemed to matter anymore. The heat pulsing from the earth beneath them did most of the work. Marlin Cutter, usually a stubborn pillar of pride, sat with his back against the wall, staring into the dim glow of the room. At last he spoke, his voice humbled and raw. "I built my cabin to show I belonged here," he murmured. "Thought I had something to prove. That this land had to bend to me." He shook his head. "And I nearly lost everything because of it." Silas Rourke watched him a moment, then responded in the quiet way only frontier men can. "The land doesn't bend," he said. "It teaches. Some lessons just cost more than others." The Huxleys drifted into exhausted sleep. The Birdwell children leaned against their mother's side. Helena scribbled by lamplight, documenting each hour, each temperature, each miracle of the earthhouse. "This shelter breathes with us," she wrote. "It has become a single, living thing." Around midnight, the wind hit a new octave, a chilling, rising howl that gave the storm its infamous name. Snow hammered the hillside, trying desperately to force its way into the shelter. But every blow softened against the sod roof, every gust deflected by the shape of the land. Walls of earth do not rattle. They endure. At 2 a.m, Elias checked the thermometer hanging from a peg. 49 degrees. Steady. Stable. He added 2 sticks of wood, not because he feared cooling, but because he wanted those inside to feel hope when they woke. And that's when the deeper truth revealed itself. Above ground survival was a battle, constant, draining, merciless. Below ground survival was cooperation. The earthhouse wasn't resisting the storm. It was absorbing it, reshaping it, turning its fury into nothing more than a muffled hum. The night dragged on, long as a winter shadow, but no one inside froze. No one lost breath to cold. No one felt their heartbeat slow with fear. When dawn finally came, the storm's howl softened into a tired groan. Red Valley had been pushed to the brink, but inside the earthhouse, life warmed the walls. Part 12, Chapter 11, The Thaw, The Awakening. On the morning of the 4th day, the world changed. The wind stopped so abruptly it felt like someone had slammed a door on the storm. The air warmed a little, just enough for breath to stop turning to ice the moment it left your mouth. And for the first time in what felt like eternity, the sun broke through the clouds. Elias stepped outside first, pushing against a drift nearly shoulder-high. Snow glittered across the valley, smooth and untouched, as if winter had laid a single white sheet over the land. But beneath that beauty lay a heartbreaking truth. The Huxley cabin leaned to one side, roof sagging under the weight of ice. Its walls, swollen and cracked, looked like they had endured a siege. The Birdwell cabin had fared worse, tar paper shredded, door nearly blown from its hinges, frost thick on the interior logs. Cutter's proud cabin, once the jewel of Red Valley, bore the worst scars. The decorative beam that split during the first night had collapsed inward. Windows shattered, floors warped, and the fuel nearly gone. What they had spent months gathering was burned in a handful of days. But the earthhouse stood just as it had before the storm. Sod roof intact, doorway dry, no frost inside, no warping, no damage. It looked as though it had simply slept through the worst winter in valley history. Neighbors gathered around Elias, still stunned by the contrast. Some touched the roof, some inspected the walls, some simply stared. Helena Ledger, notebook in hand, whispered the words that would be repeated for generations. "We mocked the man who built into the earth, yet his home is the only thing winter could not break." Cutter approached Elias slowly. Gone was the swagger, gone was the bravado. "You saved my life," he said quietly. "Not because you meant to, but because you built smarter than the rest of us." Elias shook his head. "Not smarter," he replied, "just willing to learn from the land instead of forcing it to learn from me." The thaw had revealed more than damage. It revealed truth. Red Valley's pride had cost them dearly, while humility, expressed through simple earthbound design, had preserved life. And that's the awakening every frontier community eventually faces. Sometimes the old ways, the buried ways, the ways we once dismissed as primitive, were the strongest all along. Part 13, Chapter 12, Engineering of Survival. In the days that followed, as the valley slowly clawed its way back to life, Curiosity replaced fear. People began to ask questions, not about the storm, but about the structure that had quietly defied it. Elias didn't brag. He didn't strut. He simply knelt in the snow and scraped away a section of sod roof so the neighbors could see how it all worked. "This," he said, pointing to the brush layer beneath, "keeps the water moving sideways instead of down. Water only destroys what doesn't give it a path." Marlin Cutter leaned in close, his breath still shaky from days of cold. Elias lifted one sod block and showed the woven roots below. "Living material," he explained. "It flexes with the seasons. A living roof lasts because it adapts." Old Sparrow watched silently, nodding as though she had known all along. "The earth remembers what men forget," she finally said. "That warmth isn't made, it's kept." Elias described how the frost line worked, how temperatures below 3 feet of soil barely shifted all year. "Your cabins lost heat because wind touched every surface," he said. "Mine lost almost nothing because only one surface is exposed to the cold, the door. Reduce what the cold can reach, and you reduce what it can steal." Helena Ledger scribbled as fast as she could. "This is not luck," she muttered. "It's design." Elias went on, teaching without ever calling it teaching. He explained the intake vent near the floor, how cold air must be introduced low so it warms before rising. He explained the outlet vent near the roof, how every shelter needs a way for stale air to escape. He pointed out how the doorway sat recessed in the slope to block wind shear, how the floor crowned slightly for drainage, how the sod roof acted as both insulation and camouflage. But perhaps the most important lesson he shared was this: a house above ground must always fight nature. A house within the earth borrows nature's strength. One burns fuel, the other preserves it. Then he spoke words that Helena later called the heartbeat of that winter's wisdom. "Modern builders focus on what looks sturdy," Elias said softly. "But survival isn't about looking strong, it's about understanding where strength truly comes from." And in that moment, surrounded by neighbors who had nearly lost everything, the true engineering of survival revealed itself. Not as an act of resistance, but as an act of cooperation between man and the land he stands on. Part 14, Chapter 13, The Psychology of a Community. In the weeks that followed, Red Valley confronted something harder than cold: its own pride. Helena Ledger wrote a line that captured the mood perfectly. "We froze because we wanted our homes to look like homes," she said. "We chose appearance over endurance." And she wasn't wrong. Every cabin in the valley had been built to satisfy an idea of civilization, of fitting in, of showing progress. But ideas crumble quickly when winter bares its teeth. The neighbors began talking in low, embarrassed tones. They remembered, with reddening faces, how loudly they had mocked Silas Rourke, how certain they had been that a man digging into the dirt was digging his own failure, how convinced they were that outward pride mattered more than inward strength. Cutter, perhaps the most changed of all, admitted it openly. "I laughed because I didn't understand," he said, "and because it felt safer to laugh than to learn." His words echoed through the general store like a confession weighted by frost. What happened in Red Valley wasn't just a battle against the cold. It was a lesson about human behavior, how communities often resist the very solutions that could save them. People cling to what they know, even when what they know no longer works. They mock the unfamiliar because they fear being wrong. They choose the comfort of tradition over the discomfort of innovation. But survival doesn't care about pride or conformity. It cares only about truth. And the truth that winter revealed was simple. Strength is not always visible. Wisdom is not always loud. And the people who see beyond convention, the ones willing to listen to old ideas, buried ideas, indigenous ideas, are often the ones who lead us through darkness. Old Sparrow said it best one evening as neighbors gathered near the stove in Helena's shop. "The valley did not freeze because of cold alone," she murmured. "It froze because we trusted what was new, but not what was true." And from that day forward, the laughter once directed at Elias turned into gratitude and a quiet respect for the power of humility. Part 15, Closing Message, A Frontier Man's Final Word. As spring crept into Red Valley, the snow melted away to reveal not just damage, but understanding. The cabins bore scars that would take months to repair. The earthhouse, by contrast, looked untouched, as though winter had bowed before it. Families began planning their next homes, not upward, but inward, into the hillsides, into the folds of the land, into the forgotten wisdom that had sheltered humans long before sawmills and catalog plans. Red Valley had awakened, and if you stand on that slope today, feeling the warmth stored inside the earth, you'll understand what Elias meant when he said, "Build with the land, not against it." Because out here on the frontier, your greatest ally is rarely the thing you build, but the ground you choose to build upon. That's the lesson I want you to carry with you long after this story fades. When storms come, literal or figurative, strength doesn't come from standing tall. It comes from standing smart. It comes from lowering yourself into the wisdom of what has lasted for centuries. It comes from knowing that humility is not weakness, but design. So if you one day find yourself building, whether a home, a plan, or a life, remember the earthhouse under Iron Mesa. Remember the laughter that turned into awe. Remember how the land held the warmth that saved 12 souls on the coldest night Red Valley ever saw. And remember this, on the worst night of winter, time and warmth belong to those who prepare before the storm arrives. Thank you for watching Frontier Ways. If this story stirred something in you, some old instinct to build wiser, live closer to the land, or honor the lessons nature keeps offering, then stay with us. There are more frontier truths ahead, and each one might be the spark you need for your own journey.